John 15:6 has some really interesting words that are going to require you to spend some time in a dictionary to really understand. And there's a couple of interesting textual variants I'm going to point out as well. Ean me tismene inamoi, iblethe exo, hos ta klema kai exeranthe, kai sunagusin auta, kai esta pur balusin, kai kayatai. We'll just go through the sentence and then we'll come back and look at some of the things. Ean me, so we're in a third class conditional sentence. Unless someone remains in me, what's going to happen if you don't remain in Christ? Iblethe, you notice you have a beta and you have a lambda, and that's really all you need because you know that you can drop out vowels and you can have double consonants go to single. This is the aorist passive of balo. And the trick here is, why is it aorist? He is thrown outside as the branch. In other words, he's just like a branch, he's thrown outside, and withers. We'll come back to that as well. And they gather them, so you have the introduction of a new actors, it's the people doing the threshing. And they will gather them, and into the fire they throw. So they throw these dead branches into the fire, and they are burned. Let's go ahead and phrase this, and then we can look at some of these unusual tenses and words. So you have the beginning of your third class conditional sentence. If someone does not remain in me, or unless someone remains in me, now we get to the main point. They are cast outside as a branch. And what happens to the branches? So you have your connector, and they are withered. And here's what happens after they're cast out and they wither. They gather them, the branches, and they throw them, understood, we'll check a variant there later on, they throw them into the fire and they are burned. Okay, so here's your main sentence, or at least the first part of the main sentence, that they are cast outside as a branch. So there's your sign of judgment, right? And so we'll say, well, unless someone remains in me, they are cast outside as a branch, and not only are they cast outside, but they are withered. So what you have are your two parallel statements, right? Cast outside and they wither. And another connective. And what happens after they're cast out and they wither? They, meaning the threshers, they gather them, and I guess I would need to do it this way. And they are cast into the fire, and they are burned. So there's your series of verbs. And I guess if you wanted to make the parallelism a little clear, that these final two verbs go with sunagusin, what you could do is keep that up there and put a tab before the ace. And that means that this connective goes here, and you can bring kayatai over here. So what you have is your parallelism being cast out, and they wither. And then as a result, what happens next? They are gathered, or they gather them, and they are thrown in the fire, and they're burned up. There's probably different ways that you can lay this sentence out to see the parallel structures. So let's go back and look at some of these forms, because there's some things here that are really important. That if someone remains in me, why is this an aorist? Why is this an aorist? Well, there's some lengthened discussions you can go to, and you can look at Don Carson's commentary in the Pillar series, and he has a discussion of it, and in his additional note, he has even more. And what compounds this, or maybe what explains this, is in here, Jesus switches into the present, right? Well, the presents are easier to handle. They're just customary presents. It's a category of the present to describe what happens, just generally what happens. It's axiomatic. And they're presents and not aorists because they are processes, right? There's a process of the men gathering them, and the process of burning, and the process of throwing. So it makes sense that they're presents. But the interesting thing is the aorist, and I think the simplest explanation is that what we're learning in aspectual theory in Greek is that the aorist is used to describe a prior action, and the subsequent action is in the present tense. Carson says that what the aorist is used here is to indicate completeness. The judgment is complete. The judgment is decisive, and that certainly can be possible. But the point is, in English, when we hear a sequence, we understand that it's a chronological sequence, and Greek doesn't do that, and so they use the aorist followed by the present to indicate sequence. First of all, the branches are cast outside. They're taken away from the vineyard, and as they sit there, they wither, and then subsequently they come along and they cast them into the fire, and they are burned up. So it's more of an indication, I think, at least at a minimum, of this idea of sequence. The aorist could also be gnomic, just like the presents are gnomic. This is just generally what happens. If you don't remain in Christ, you're cast outside and you're going to wither. That's just the way things are. And the subsequent action is, you look at the branches, they're gathered together, thrown in the fire, and burned. There's your judgment. And so also it is for people who do not remain in Christ. So in terms of the translation, aorist passive, I would just do it because they're gnomic, as they are cast out and are withered. They do wither, is a good way to do it. And that way it keeps the sequence going with sunagosin and the other verbs. So I would translate it, if someone remains in me, they are cast out as a branch. And, okay, why passive here? Well, this is why you always have to have a good dictionary with you. And when you look up, say, rhino, you can see that it has, the first definition is to stop a flow, such as sap or a liquid in something, and so cause dryness. Their gloss is to dry up. But look at this. In the active, it's to dry or dry out. In the passive, it's a sense of becoming dry, becoming dried up, of withering. Now, we don't use the passive to describe that action in English. And so, when it comes back to translating xeranthe, you can just translate it, they wither. Okay, that doesn't sound passive, but the Greek is passive to indicate the sense of something causing to be withered. And so the way you bring that into English is just in the present tense, and that's a good way to do it. This idea of causation helps us to understand kaiatai as well. That one of the definitions in BDAG is to cause something to be burned up so as to be consumed. In other words, to burn up. So again, we would translate this. They gather them and they throw the branches into the fire, and the branches are burned up. The other thing that's kind of fun to point out are the variants. So if someone does not remain in me, he is cast outside as the branch and it withers, and they gather auta. See, what's interesting, you have this variant that goes to the singular auta. Why? Well, because you have a singular branch, and it felt awkward to go to the plural, so some scribe changed it to the singular, so the branch is gathered. But obviously, what's being pictured here is that the threshers are gathering all of these dead branches, and into the fire they throw. And this variant is it adds in P66, it adds the direct object, and they throw them into the fire. So some scribe just felt that we needed to have an express direct object. We obviously don't. Greek does this all the time. But anyway, again, you never talk about variants without talking about their significance. Some people would call these errors in the text. It's just some scribe trying to make the Greek a little smoother, a little easier. And in the case of the auta with the klema, a little more grammatically consistent, but it's unnecessary. All right, I know that was a lot in this sentence, but there was lots of stuff worth pointing out.